happy to welcome you to tonight's exciting Politics and Prose virtual event. We greatly appreciate your continued support during these extraordinary times, and we're so glad to still be able to bring the authors you love and their new books to the Politics and Prose community. At any point during the event, you can click on the link in the chat to purchase Mr. Humble and Dr. Butcher on the Politics and Prose website. Additionally, you can ask tonight's speakers questions by clicking on Q&A, which can be found near the bottom of your screen. And while we'll try to get to everyone's questions, we apologize in advance if we don't have time to address yours. Finally, we want to thank you for being here with us today. It's your support that keeps us going. And now I'm thrilled to introduce you to tonight's speakers. Dr. Brandy Schillace is a historian of medicine and the critically acclaimed author of Death's Summer Coat, What Death and Dying Teach Us About Life and Living, and Clockwork Futures, The Science of Steampunk. I would recommend checking both out, and I'd also recommend checking out her TEDx talk on steampunk science too. She's the editor-in-chief of the journal Medical Humanities, and she previously worked as a professor of literature and in research and public engagement at the Dietrich Medical History Center and Museum. She will be in conversation with Dr. Lindsey Fitzharris, best-selling author of The Butchering Art and the host of the new TV series, The Curious Life and Death of, on the Smithsonian Channel, which explores some of the most mysterious deaths in history. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Schillace and Dr. Fitzharris to PNP Live.
All right. Thank you. By the way, it's super weird doing these Zoom events, isn't it, Brandy? You can't hear anybody. I see my friend Joel saying applause. But yeah, first of all, I just want to thank everybody for joining. I know people are coming from all over the globe. I'm super excited about that. So thanks for coming out to support Brandy. It's really hard for authors right now who are launching during a pandemic. And I have all kinds of reminders that we're in a pandemic, including my plague doctor mug that I'll be sipping from. So before we start, I just want to give you a little bit of background on Brandy, because Brandy and I are real life friends. This isn't like an awkward author conversation where two people who don't know each other are thrown into a Zoom. Although I am an awkward person, so there probably will be awkward moments in this interview. But needless to say, Brandy and I have known each other for years, and she hosted me in 2017 on my book tour for The Butchering Art. So it's a real honor and privilege to be able to interview her about this wacky, weird story that she's written. And so I just want to jump into it, Brandy. Sure. One of my favorite parts of your book actually was right at the beginning, because you kind of insert yourself in this story. And I hope that in future books, Brandy is more in these books, because you are a character as well. But you say that sometimes a story chooses you, not the other way around. So let's start with the shoebox and how you came about this crazy story about head transplants.
Absolutely. So this story pursued me actually twice. So it originally came from, I got a strange phone call from a colleague of mine who's a neurosurgeon scientist, and he had asked me, I was at a thrift store. I wasn't really ready for this question. Say, do you ever hear about head transplant? And I had not. So it took me a little bit off guard. It just so happened about a year and a half later, same fella called me and said, I really think you need to come down to my office. I've got something I want to show you. So when a neurosurgeon invites you to their office, it's kind of exciting. You don't know what you're going to be in for. So I headed down. I walked into his office, and he does something kind of unexpected. He just pulls up this shoebox and sets it on the desk and just kind of pushes it at me. And, I'm breaking the ice, right? I say something silly like, oh, it was not a brain in there. Right. So I opened up the top of the box, and it was not a brain, but it was a notebook, and it was like the old, I'm trying to think of like a scientific notebook with the graph paper. It was clearly tattered and aged, and I lifted it out and I start just flipping through it, and it's got tiny little cramped writing in all of these spaces. It's got pasted in notes and little brown flecks of things like stain. And I asked my friend, I said, what's that, do you think? And he said, well, it's probably mouse blood. And that's also really an unexpected thing, right? So, okay, I start looking a little bit more carefully, and it's about mice brains. It's about taking brains out of mice, or trying to isolate brains in mice, or various other kinds of mouse brain apparatus. And I asked him, I said, what is this about? He's like, remember that phone call? there's a gentleman who performed a head transplant on monkeys, and I thought maybe you might like to write about his life story. We have some of his archive material. And at that point, I'm holding a blood-flecked brain notebook from a head transplant guy that was given to me by a neurosurgeon. It's kind of a yes at that point.
Yeah.
Like, I don't
at
feel like
that point.
you don't back out of that, right?
It's like, it feels like it's like this almost like magical journey. You open it up and the box is glowing and you're like, holy shit, where's this taking me? But you know, you worked at a medical museum, history museum, and you must have come across lots of weird stuff. And you know, I can imagine that there's a lot of different stories that are pursuing you, as you put it. For people who are joining in and don't quite know what we're talking about, she wrote a book about a surgeon called Robert White, and he performed a head transplant. She says, and so we're going to get into that a lot, but the book is called Mr. Humble and Dr. Butcher, which obviously invokes the very famous story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So tell me about Robert White, the surgeon who you tell this incredible story about, and how he reflects that duality that we see in that very famous story.
So much of this book is about duality, I think
that Brandy might be, oh, no, there she is.
Oh, I'm back. I'm here.
Oh, I thought I was going to have to take over there. Whew, okay.
Oh, whew.
I was breaking out into sweat.
I was going to say, so much of this book is about duality because, and this is true of all of us, right? Nobody is a singular. We have many different aspects of our personality, and we compartmentalize different things. So Dr. White was a neurosurgeon. He was also a neuroscientist. So he had a PhD as well. He was a deeply devout Catholic. He had 10 children, being a deeply devout Catholic. He was actually friends with Pope John Paul II, which is unusual.
Wow. Yeah.
And he is known for saving lives. In Cleveland, he's quite famous. If you mention his name in Cleveland, Ohio, someone's likely to say, oh, he saved my cousin, my uncle, my dad. And he was this benevolent sort of figure. So thus, Mr. Humble. Though he did give himself the name Mr. Humble.
That's
the nickname he chose.
Doesn't make you so humble when you call yourself humble.
Maybe. But he was also somebody who was pushing the boundaries of science in really peculiar ways, including investigating whether a brain could outlive its body, could live outside of its body. And ultimately, that resulted in him taking a head from one primate and putting it on another primate to test that theory. And he had a lot of reasons for doing that, but obviously it's a little upsetting to people to think that you're going to take heads off things or take brains out of things. And it does sound Frankenstein, but to me, the story is far more about how he's sort of two different characters in some ways, you know, but yet the same man. And to me, that was the most astonishing and fascinating part.
Yeah, I mean, for me also, one of the interesting parts about his character is his religion. You know, I wrote this book, The Butchering Art, which is about Joseph Lister. And if anybody's read it, he was a Quaker, and this really informed his science. I think, you know, it's important to remember that science and medical progress isn't created in a vacuum, and we're part of the influences around us. So Robert White's Catholicism was a big part of his life. And him trying to do these head transplants, I'm kind of skipping ahead. We're gonna get to the head transplants and all the weird stuff very shortly. But just like, tell me a little bit about how did he marry his Catholicism to this very kind of almost what we might say is barbaric experiments that he was doing?
Yes, well, it's funny. I would almost say that it was driven by his Catholicism. You see, for White, the brain is you. And I think a lot of us feel that way too, right? We all feel, whether you believe in a soul or not, I think we all have this sense that there's an animating principle that makes us who we are. And for many people these days, it's not beyond the pale to suggest it might be in your brain. But for White, it was specifically, exclusively in the human brain that the soul lived. And he believed that it was the repository of the soul. One of the strange but interesting quotes, he talked about holding a brain and as though it was a perfume bottle, and the perfume, the soul had gone, you know. Mm-hmm. So he's very specific about this very tactile, tangible way of seeing the soul. Thus, you can see how if you want to see if the brain can survive the body, in a way, you're also proving or trying to prove that the soul outlives the body. And so there's a real connection between his belief in the immortal soul that lives on and the work that he does. And he also felt that because the brain is you, saving the life of that brain was the most important thing that you could do at almost any cost. So again, if you can preserve the brain, let's say your body is dying, in his mind, if you could preserve the brain, that was still a laudable and correct thing to do. And that was tantamount to saving the soul. So that's a really interesting connection to make there, is that you make these decisions to save lives and souls, and that it's God driven.
But what about, the ethics of it? What's the goal to be immortal? Was that like sort of like that this would just be something that you could perpetuate, that you could just constantly, get new bodies? I'm totally jumping ahead, but things that you're saying just fascinate me about, the idea too, that if we could achieve immortality, all the ethical implications about overpopulation and what does it mean to be alive, all of that. So, I mean, as a Catholic, it just makes me wonder, like, he must have thought about those aspects of the question too. Like, living forever is also problematic, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. I don't think White was not necessarily interested in living forever. However, there are other people down the road who take his ideas and kind of go in that direction.
Right.
That's absolutely true. But what he mostly wanted was for no one's life to be cut short before its time. And there's a great anecdote about a soccer player who gets injured and he becomes paralyzed from the neck down, and he's asking the doctors to kill him, to let him die. Mm-hmm. And one of the residency doctors was like, wow, I really feel for him. I'm sorry we can't do this for him. And Dr. White was furious. He's like, you never end a life. That is not your job. That's above your pay grade. Like, you save lives. They're worth saving. And just because someone's paralyzed doesn't mean their life isn't worth saving. So in that case, they do save the man's life, and he later gets married and he has kids. And so clearly you can have a life. Your life is worth saving, whether or not you're able-bodied. It's very ableist to say somehow that if you're not able-bodied, it's not worth it. But he also was constantly working on children. So it's a trauma hospital. He's seeing a lot of children with brain injuries, traumatic brain injuries, brain cancer. And to not be able to save all of them, I really feel like it deeply impacted him.
Yeah. Well, the world, I think one of the things that you do really well is talk about the world that White first comes into. And that's really important to giving a context of who he ultimately becomes, because again, to go back to nothing is made in a vacuum. And the world that White enters into as a medical student is an exciting world, because transplant science suddenly is a feasible thing. And so Brandy talks extensively about the first transplant, which was a kidney transplant. Now, to us in the 21st century, organ transplantation, it's all very normal to us. Let's put the head transplants to the side. Talk to us about why organ transplants were controversial at all, because this was not something that was necessarily that people thought we should be doing.
Exactly. Well, one of the things that I tried to do in the book, because I do think we get used to things and you almost have to reweird them, because not that long ago, the idea that your heart could beat in someone else's chest would have been mind-boggling. I mean, people just didn't think it was possible, and they weren't sure they liked the idea. And even now, I think face transplant is a particular area where people get kind of like, well, but it's your face, but it's not your face. So this idea that you could take an organ out of someone's body and save another life with it was both exciting but fraught. People weren't sure how to feel about it. But one of the reasons they were nervous is they wanted to know, how do you take a living organ out of a dead body? Do you have to wait for the body to be dead? What does that mean? If the brain is alive or not? So the concept of brain death is a big debate in this time period, because there's no recognized, constantly agreed upon definition of brain death, and there still kind of isn't.
In the US, like, every state's different, right? Like, every state has a different definition for what that means.
Exactly. And on top of that, it's mainly a legal definition, not a specifically medical definition, because there's a lot to it. How much brain activity counts as brain activity? Is it the autonomic system? Is it, so basically the question was, when is a body dead enough to take its organs? And that troubled people because people were really scared that that doctors would go in and take your organs before you were done, before you were really gone, and that they would sort of prematurely kill you, basically. And this becomes really fraught when this is civil rights era. Right. And, one of the first heart transplants was a Black man's heart went into a white man's body in South Africa, where there was still apartheid. And, the newspaper said things like, his heart can now go places his body wasn't allowed because Black people couldn't go to the theaters. So, there were all of these different aspects. The Black community in the United States responded to those early transplants, particularly that one with the Black heart and the white man, and said, oh my goodness, we're minorities. We're going to be harvested. We're just going to be harvested for people who have more cultural capital, who are white or who are wealthy, and we're not going to matter. And so there was real fear about what were the ethics going to be. And, it was a requirement. We needed to get a commission together to have people decide, what's the ethical definition? What's the ethical way of doing this?
It's funny because I spoke to a medical audience recently. I don't know if you've yet done that with this book, but it's always interesting because they ask different kinds of questions than general readership does. And one of the men who asked a question said, well, I'm a transplant surgeon. And actually, we still don't really talk openly about the process and what we do because people still find that quite cringeworthy. I think that, even that fear that, your doctor will kill you for your organs, it's still something you hear echoed. Like people feel if they're an organ donor, their doctor might not work that hard to save their life, even though the doctor who's treating you and the doctor who's going to do the organ transplant are different doctors, and these decisions are made separately. So I still think there's a lot of fear around organ donation. And, we could go way back hundreds of years about bodies being stolen and, these kinds of fears, but all this is happening around white. So he thinks, if a kidney, why not a heart? If a heart, why not a head? But before we get to that, let's talk about this term head transplant, because a lot of people on social media have been wondering, is it a head transplant? Is it a body transplant? Let's talk about how White defines this.
So I want to step back just a tiny bit to say a little bit more about White as a person and as a character, because he was someone who could really sort of see things all the way around it, right? It's a very three-dimensional view of things. And one of the more interesting things to me is how his views do change over time. So when he does the head transplant on the monkey, this is the successful one in the 1970s, right. He's published papers about it, and it's called a cephalic transplant. In other words, a head transplant. It is literally taking the head off of one monkey and transplanting it. When he starts to speak about doing this with human beings, he calls it a body transplant.
Interesting.
There's a couple reasons for that, right? There's some interesting rhetorical reasons for that, but there's also ethical reasons for that. White did not believe that animals had souls. That dictates some of his treatment of animals, why he was comfortable doing experiments on them. It's also what gets him into a lot of trouble with PETA, with other animal rights activists who are like, why are you doing these? What is the point of these surgeries? Why are you doing this to animals? It's not right. But to him, and he was adamant about this, no, monkeys don't have souls. I'm just transplanting a head. But when he starts talking about human beings, remember, this is you to him. This is everything you are. It's not just your personality, it's your immortal soul is attached to your brain. Therefore, what he wants to do is give you new organs. Therefore, he wants to transplant all the organs at one time. Be very efficient about it. Just take the whole body and put it over here under this head. So it becomes known as the body transplant. But for various reasons in his interviews, he tends to kind of bounce back and forth between the two terminologies. I think partly because he started off calling them head transplants and then later.
Head transplant is a better headline. Quite frankly. Like I remember, it must have been about 4 years ago. I was in a train station in Scotland, and there was a surgeon who's like trying to revive this, or he says he's close to being able to do this. And I remember there was like a headline on New Scientist magazine and said something about head transplants. And I said to my husband, "Oh, head transplants," and he said, "Well, wouldn't it be a head transplant, would it?" And I was like, oh yeah, I guess not, but it's not, but you think of it as a head transplant, I guess it's a better headline. But, going back to animals, my first question about the animals is they didn't have souls. He didn't believe that, but did he believe they could feel pain? And was that problematic to him?
He did follow. So the rules have really changed quite a lot over time. One of the important things about the book is that it stretches from the 50s to the 90s, and this 40-year period, radical changes happen.
Yeah,
actually, even a little bit before the 50s. So at the time, he was always following all the rules for experimentation, meaning you provide the animals with anesthetic, you make sure that you are limiting their pain, you make sure that all of these different things. But at the same time, they can't necessarily tell you how they're feeling about it. And so a lot of animal rights activists were saying things like, you say that you're limiting their pain, but how do you know that that's actually happening? What's your that? And today we have much stricter rules about what you can do with experimental animals, which animals you can use for what kinds of things, how they're treated in between, what kind of stimulation they require in order to have healthy, happy lives, or as experimental animals. But, White was in a really interesting time period where there was less of that. And then there was more of it. And while he was quite upset about he did not like dealing with animal rights activists, they're the reason we have better rules about these things.
Right.
So, it's an interesting.
I mean, for me, I obviously am known for writing horrific stories about medicine and grisly stuff, but the animal stuff was hard to read. And on that note, I want to get to the two-headed dog, because this story blew my mind. I didn't know it existed. I don't often go far into the 20th century. My next book's sort of World War I, but I don't venture that far. So the idea that the Soviets had created this two-headed dog, that there was video footage, it just blew my mind. So tell us about that and the central importance to White's work ultimately.
Absolutely. So again, White had the first idea about potential head transplant, brain transplant, body transplant, all the way back when he was at Peter Brent Brigham when the first kidney transplant happened. So he was there when that happened. And, but at the same time, he's thinking, I wonder how you could make something like that happen. Well, then in 1958, this grainy black and white footage appears, and it's not got sound, the original one. A doctor, or seemingly a doctor, some man in a white coat, leading out this animal, and out walks this large sort of mastiff dog with a second head and forepaws surgically attached to its body.
Have you seen this footage?
I have.
You actually, oh, wow. Okay. Because there's a picture in your book, which I kind of wanted to show it, but I don't want to upset people, but there are images in her book. So
there's some slightly triggering images in the book, actually. But yes, so they named it Cerberus. Cerberus, after the three-headed dog from Hades, but it actually just had the two, and it wasn't just heads. They had taken the front part of a body of a smaller dog, so it still had its own. It still had its own forepaws. It still, they showed the dog literally it could still lick up milk. It could still move. Both the dogs could move, but there's no way of prolonging its life. So remember, this is pre suppression of the immune system. We don't have drugs for that. So no matter what, if you're not performing a kidney transplant on an identical twin, which is what the first kidney transplant was, you're going to have problems. Eventually the body's going to reject these parts. So they were making these dogs, and that was only one of them. There was actually several of these two-headed dog creations made by Vladimir Demikov, a physiologist in Moscow. And none of them were going to live for very long. So it was very unclear what the surgeries were for. But what they did is they really, they opened up a window for White, because he's thinking, if they can do this, then we can do, there's a lot of tension, right? This is the Cold War. And if Russia's going to do it, then if the Soviet Union is going to do it, then the USA is going to do it. And there's tends to be this kind of race, just like the space race. And the space race was also very detrimental to primates. There's a lot of animal experimentation that was done for the space race as well, sending animals up in capsules, knowing they weren't going to make it. So it's a very similar kind of time period where we as a country and funding bodies and governments were sort of willing to back certain kinds of projects because we were in competition with the Soviet Union. And so I think that's also that drove kind of this interest. I'm going to do this, but I'm going to do it better. I'm going to do it with primates instead of with dogs.
I mean, I was about to show it, but one of my friends, Annabelle, who's a brilliant cake maker, by the way, she'll probably end up making a cake of this two-headed dog. She said, don't Google it, which I know all of you guys are going to Google this. And so I will not be responsible for upsetting anybody during this event.
You can probably find the
if you want to see it. But yeah, I mean, the inclusion of the images are startling, and it definitely is one of those stories that, really stands out in your book. And speaking of weird stories, tell me about the brain isolation experiments, because this is also super weird.
I have to say, for me, so I've worked in a medical history museum. I'm often hard to shock, generally.
Wait, now, please say what you said to Wired, because you gotta say that.
I slipped at Wired. I mentioned the fact that at the medical museum that I worked at, we had a lot of books on skin disorders and skin diseases. And I believe I said, once you've seen as much syphilitic genitalia as I have, you're hard to shock. It's true.
It is hard to shock. And by the way, that's the perfect thing to say to Wired, and the perfect thing to say to people who come from my platform. They're going to love you for that. But yeah, the brain isolation experiment, talk us through that.
Yeah, so that actually was the part that I think made me the most uncomfortable in terms of the actual surgeries. Again, I talk about surgeries all the time. I research them. I research the science. But let me explain what the disconnect is. If I ask all of you listening to just imagine a brain, right? You're probably going to think of a nice, clean, isolated. It looks kind of like a walnut. It's pink. It's squishy. You might even think of, Igor or something with the jar from Young Frankenstein. And it seems like, oh yes, this is a completely isolated organ. We don't often ask, how do we get there? Now, obviously, if you are dissecting a dead body, person or animal, that's one thing. But the brain isolation experiments that White did was to do this on a living brain. In other words, he wanted the brain alive still after the body had been removed. So what that means, and I want you to know, I toned this down a lot for the actual book. I didn't go all the places we could have gone, but they're cutting away a living being from its brain. That means they're removing the body, they're removing the face, they're taking away the skull to get to this little naked bulb of brain. And then it's sitting on a little apparatus, and it's being flushed with blood, by the way. The brain's very greedy for oxygen. You will destroy the brain if it loses any oxygen at all. One of the things he learned from this experiment is that you could hypercool, you could cool down a brain quite a lot, make it less greedy. And actually, he was nominated for a Nobel Prize for hypothermia experiments, for therapeutic hypothermia. But anyway, it had to be suffused with blood. He used a larger monkey to do this. So he's got a big monkey pumping blood into the head, or what's left of the small monkey. And then he just slowly takes the rest of it apart. And what he's left with, and this is the part that I think is the most mind-blowing, almost more mind-blowing than the head transplant itself, is a small platform with a living, naked brain, suffused with blood, hooked up to wires so that they can measure its output, because this tiny brain without a body is thinking. It's still alive.
It's so disturbing. It's so disturbing.
It's unexpected, I will say that.
I mean, honestly, that story alone, you guys have to buy this book off the basis of that, because there's so many quirky, weird stories that you tell that, I mean, so for you, the brain isolation experiment was one of the hardest parts to write, because
I think so.
why?
Yeah, because, well, partly because I think I had just never, I think we all get very comfortable with medicine doing stuff.
Mm-hmm.
We don't think about all the experiments that bring us the things that we like.
Yeah.
I would say there is a reason for doing the isolation experiment. He had a reason, and it was partly the reason we isolate organs to study them is to study, like, what are drug interactions? What happens with this if it's not being mediated by a body? What does that tell us about drug interactions or types of pharmaceutical things we can do? What does it tell us about how blood runs through the brain? There's a lot of things that are good about these experiments. It's just that we have a tendency to accept things from science and from medicine without looking back at how we actually arrive at those things. But I will say this, not everybody believed that the brain was thinking. So he produced these, he's like, look, see, here's the EEG, it's making the wiggles. Yeah. And there were people going, nah. I mean, he presented it at a big meeting. They were really excited. They were like, oh, this is fantastic. We'll have an isolated brain. We can, measure all of these other things, metabolic rates, etc. But when he got to the part where he said, look, see, it's still alive. The brain it's still in there. Nobody really was that keen on it. They explained it away. It was a mistake. It was an error. It was, reflex action. It was leftover electrical impulse. They had all that sort of reasons. And that was when White decided he would go to Moscow. He would go to the Soviet Union. He would try to meet with Vladimir Demikov. He would learn about this, and he would try to transplant a brain inside its head, because then you still have all the nerves attached to the face, and you can show that the eyes are still moving, the mouth is moving. You can show that the brain is.
By the way, as you're speaking, if you see me looking off to the side, it's because I have control of the questions here are lighting up as you're speaking. Everybody's like, holy crap, I need to. And actually, I'm not really supposed to open them up yet, but someone did ask a question that is so relevant right now, whether there was any evidence of any visual or auditory information being processed through the brain, the isolated brain. Is there a way to even know that?
So yes, this is okay. This is going to sound even stranger than what I just told you. All these things really happen. They did want to measure that. They were trying to figure out a way to do it. It's hard to keep a brain alive just on a dish. So they decided one way to do this was to do dogs instead, and to just get rid of the distance between the donor body and the brain, and just put the brain inside the donor body somewhere. So they did it on dogs, and they basically inserted the brain of one dog into the neck cavity of another dog. And then they measured that brain's EEG stuff from inside the dog's neck. I know that sounds peculiar, but there were reasons for doing this. They could keep the brain alive a lot longer. They also discovered that probably because of the blood-brain barrier, the body of the other dog didn't reject the brain. It's like it didn't even notice it was there.
That's crazy.
I mean, you feel like you'd notice if you had a brain in your neck.
Yeah.
But apparently the dog didn't seem to notice. So they were measuring it, and what they did is they stimulated, they rang bells, they did other things to test, like, did the part of the brain that normally fires for auditory respond? I mean, they were able to test and find out that it was responding. But again, it's a little bit contentious because you're trying to look at blips on a graph and tell people what they mean. And so he felt like without doing a full head transplant, leaving the head and face nerves intact, he was going to have a hard time, proving to people that this really did work, that the brain can outlive its body if it's provided with the blood and fluids and oxygen that it needs.
I hope that people always take screenshots during these things. And I hope that one of the screenshots is just me with this face of horror. The stuff you're saying. I feel like I'm just trying not to pull all these crazy faces because you know what? I had a list of questions and it's just, I'm going off-road because there's just and a lot of people are asking questions that are really great here. But one of the things that I did want to touch on that you said, which I absolutely love about this book, and I love that you were talking about this, is the need to fail. And we need to fail in life in order to succeed. I failed many times in my life as a writer in all kinds of ways. But in medicine, it's really important. And people who follow me on various platforms, you might recognize the Clockwork Saw behind me. I've talked about this extensively. It was a major failure in the 19th century. Now, he's not obviously successful at doing the human head transplant, but his work does inform other important aspects of medicine. So what do you think his legacy actually is?
Right. Well, it's funny. I think probably I have two answers for this, because one is you can say, okay, he was nominated for a Nobel Prize. So we can look at that and we can say, oh, his legacy was that his work in therapeutic hypothermia, perfusion of the brain and spinal cord for injuries and et cetera, has reduced people's paralysis after traumatic injury. It's actually been used therapeutic hypothermia is also being used for cardiac arrest victims, because if you can cool down the brain, then the fact that there's not enough blood getting there means you don't result in brain damage. So there's a lot of scientific things like that that he did that were really important. On the other side, and this is part of the duality of this book, I'd say his legacy is people. There's so many people who lived because of surgeries. He invented surgeries. One of my favorite stories in the book is a little girl who has a strange condition. Essentially, the veins that should be on the inside of her head are on the outside. And so it's a really dangerous situation in terms of blood flow. And all these other surgeons had basically said, it's inoperable. Like, there's nothing we can do. And essentially White he built a surgery, purpose-built a surgery for this one child, and saved her life. She's an adult. She still lives in and around Cleveland. So I think his legacy is partly that the part of him that is the neurosurgeon, has living human beings as that legacy. The part of him that is a neuroscientist and kind of a bit fringe and pushing boundaries has these other experimental devices that he worked on. And even though the brain isolation experiments kind of seem grisly, and even though there doesn't seem to be a lot of reason to do a lot of head transplant things, he was exploring boundaries, circulation systems, the way the brain receives or doesn't receive blood that we do still use today. So all of that is incredibly important and invaluable, even if we struggle to see why some of the surgeries were done.
I mean, you realize though, so when I wrote The Butchering Art, one of the things that Joseph Lister had said at the end of his life was that he wanted all of his personal correspondence destroyed because he didn't want his story to be told. He wanted his story to be told only through his scientific achievements. So I always joked that Joseph Lister would have hated my book. You realize that Dr. White's legacy, to some extent, you're bringing this alive here. What do you think Dr. White would have thought of your book?
So I'm going to tell you a story about Mr. Humble. Again, tongue-in-cheek reference. He was quite a prankster. So he used to go down with his children, 10 children, lots of children, and he used to take them shopping and go down to the West Side Market in Cleveland. And he used to go pick up cow brains to take back for his students to work on, right? To dissect. And one day, while they were there, a fender bender, a car accident happened just outside. And a police officer arrived on the scene, but he actually arrived late. Like, the ambulance, everything else had already gone. Police officer arrives on the scene and is like, "Where's the accident?" And so Dr. White has one of his children take the cow brain, run up to the doctor or to the officer and say, "This fell out of one of the car accident victims. You need to rush it down to the hospital right now. It's going to be too late." And they give this brain to this police officer who doesn't know what else to do. So he drives to Metro with the lights on, with the brain in his,
I love that,
over in the next seat. And when he got there, White had called ahead and was like, "Okay, this officer's going to come down. Here's what I want you to say." And so they mess with him. But essentially, the officer gets in. He's like, "I don't know. There's an accident. I have this brain." And one of the people who speak to him basically says, "Well, we get a lot of these. I mean, which accident? Where was it? We need to put the brain in the right body. I mean, what if we..." And it's just ridiculous. Like, there's no way that was an okay thing to do, but it's really funny all the same.
Yeah.
And this anecdote,
he has a sense of humor.
Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is, this is a man who was very serious about his science, but also had a medical bag with the word Frankenstein emblazoned on it. This is a man who cared deeply about saving children's lives, who helped set up the Vatican Council for Bioethics, and who also appeared on the Big Chuck and Little John show doing skits about the Steelers. I think he'd be okay.
You think he'd be okay with this? I mean, like, thankfully for me, I usually write about people who's like, I mean, he died recently in recent history. So you've had contact with his family, and presumably they've read the book and have enjoyed it.
Hope so.
Yeah. I know that's always the sort of concern, isn't it?
Actually, really lucky. I've been very lucky. I got to work with a couple of family members to get archival material. But most recently, and actually she might be here tonight, there's a granddaughter who, oh, hi, Samantha, I just saw her pop up.
Wonderful.
She read the book and she wrote to me actually to say that it was really fun to read it because, you know, you get these things in pieces and parts and anecdotes in the family, but to have somebody actually sit down and sort of build the entire narrative so that you can follow it. So I'm really glad that she liked it. I felt like I was like, oh, yay.
Yeah, and you know, the thing is, like, we both have academic backgrounds, but we've gone to the dark side of freelance writing and storytelling. And I think that for me, and I think that you probably agree, the joy is actually bringing these stories to life for people who don't have, you know, access to these stories for whatever reason. And so I just think the way you pull people into that story is amazing. One of the things before there's all kinds of good questions here, and I'm looking. So do send in your questions because now is the time to definitely do it. But one of the things I just wanted to ask you is, there comes a time when we can do something, but we can't just ask, should we do it because we can do it? Should we do it because, you know, it's wrong? You know, should we be pushing to do body transplants in the future? You know, we know that this is being revived by another surgeon. I don't know his name. But I remember seeing stuff in the news about this. Like, what is your personal view? Is this something that medical science should still be pushing and pursuing?
You're thinking of Sergio Canavero, I think.
That's right, yeah.
He was an Italian surgeon, I believe. But it's a hard question to answer. And this is partly why I brought up the fact that for me, my moment was in realizing that I'm not comfortable. I'm perfectly comfortable with thinking of a brain outside of its body, but I become uncomfortable when I think about how we make it that way. And so I think it's hard to know where to go with science. The problem is that the future comes at you so fast. Mm-hmm. It comes at you, you're not ready for it yet. It's occurring at the speed of life. And we don't always have the capacity to know what the consequences are going to be. In some ways, now, you know, Dr. White's favorite book, one of his favorite books anyway, was Frankenstein. And science fiction is an exciting place to do these explorations because it gives you a chance to play with the consequences. What are they going to be? We don't know about the shoulds sometimes. We do the cans first and then go, oh, maybe we should have thought about the shoulds. White did say himself that he really thought that before this could take off, the ethical apparatus would have to sort of catch up. You can't just blithely go around taking heads off of people without some sort of apparatus in place, right? It's very important.
Like a net to catch them as you take them off.
No, it's not just about the can, it is also about the should. And a really good illustration of this is the Craig Vitovitz, who was the patient who volunteered to be White's first head transplant. None of this does not happen, but he volunteered to do that. And, you know, for him, he thought my life is worth saving, even though he was somebody who was already paralyzed. So the surgery, once you have your head removed, you've severed the spinal cord, the monkey transplant, it lived for about 9 days, but it could not move its body below its neck. So it proved White's point. It could look around, it could see, it could do things, but it couldn't.
The monkey lived for about 4 days or something around there.
The longest one was 9 days. Some of them lived less time than that. And they weren't giving it autoimmune or immune suppressants, so it was not going to.
So guys, in case you're confused, like he actually did successfully do a head transplant, but he didn't do a human head transplant. And actually, Molly, I think this is going to answer your question about whether a human ever volunteered to be part of this experiment, which is what Brandy's talking about right now.
So the human volunteer was Craig Vitovitz. And for him, he said he thought it was silly that people said paralysis was a reason not to do it. He's like, I'm paralyzed now and I have a full life. What is my life not worth saving? Like, what are you saying? So I thought that was a really interesting point, that he was, because he'd been paralyzed for quite a long time, some of his organs had begun to shut down, but he was still quite a young person. So for him, he thought, well, if my head can get a brand new set of organs, then I can keep on living and a lot of things won't change for me. I'm already somebody who, he was in a diving accident as a young man. On the other side, many people who've raised objections have said, yes, but if you have a body that is an organ donor and you've agreed that it's brain dead, whatever that means for wherever you are, that one body could save a heart patient, a lung patient, a liver patient, but you're taking all of those organs and giving them to only one person, who gets to make those kinds of decisions? And it comes down to really complicated ethics about how do you measure a life? What's the value? And is it okay? And if it is okay, who in the world do we get to make those decisions for us?
Yeah, I mean, that actually goes to Sonia's question about what was the ethical pushback he received in his own time. I mean, we can look at it through 2021 lenses, but like, did the medical community just go along with this? Was there no questions raised?
It's interesting because, again, his successful transplant of the monkey head to body occurred in the 70s. And, the Cold War race, there's a lot of things that got done and got funded in that time period because there was just a real impetus for doing it. Dr. White kind of felt that after the Cold War was over, some of those more sort of fringe, pushing the boundaries science projects were not looked on as favorably. I think that there's more to it than that. I don't think it's just because political climate's changed. I think that a lot of things changed. Our view of animal rights, our view of human rights, lots of things had really radically altered in the time period in which he was working. I think the biggest pushback is people just asked, who has a right to decide to do something like this? You're going to have mostly failures first. This is true of all of our transplants. Early heart patients lived maybe a week or less. Do you want to take on that kind of risk? Is that really, correct? And I will say, Sergio Canavero also had a patient who volunteered, but since then has backed out. And his reasoning for backing out was that he got married. And he said, it's one thing to know he also has a degenerative disease, which would make this, necessary to save to extend his life potentially. But his point was, and I thought this was very, very interesting way of putting it, knowing I'm going to die is one thing. Knowing I'm going to die in surgery on Tuesday is a whole other thing. So it's like that compression of time. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, also like just thinking, my next book is on facial reconstruction, and this guy during World War I who was rebuilding faces, now they're doing face transplants, and the psychological impact of that is interesting. I mean, what would the psychological impact of having somebody else's body? And is the goal to ultimately be able to marry the head and the body so the body can move? Like, would we ever even reach a stage where we could do that? I mean, as you say, science fiction becomes science fact before we know it. It's just crazy.
There's two different, it's kind of two questions, and I think they're both worth answering. The first one being the philosophical question. Again, thinking that for White, who was a bit of a Cartesian dualist, he really felt that your brain was you. For him, you would be the same. He felt that you would be the same person. You would just be on a different sort of life support system. Because he felt brains were we were brains walking around with legs. But I don't know, is that really true? I mean, I think about how embodied we really are. I think about all the neurons in the gut. I think about the fact that our various conditions, our chemicals, our hormones, all of those things help to make us who we are as people. And certainly among the LGBT, the trans community, people talk about how what your body is and does matters a lot to your identity. It really does. I mean, this is what dysphoria is all about. So to say that you're only a head or you're only a brain, I'm not sure if that's accurate, but it's certainly what he felt. So it's a good scientific and philosophical question to ask, not just who are we, but where are we?
Yeah, because I mean, you're totally, I mean, the identity, when I'm thinking about this next book and about what does it mean to have a face even, or what does a face do in terms of communicating to other people, and what happens when you lose your face or lose portions of your face. And you think about all the little things that make us who we are, the way we identify ourselves. It's hard to completely agree with White that we are only our brains. I definitely agree with that. I think that maybe you probably also agree, but everybody else can discuss this at some point. Someone says, Dr. Elliott says the original human transplant was arguably a blood transfusion. And again, it's that's idea of taking other people's bodies into us. For a long time, there was this belief that blood, that actually you talk a little bit about this in the book, the idea of where the soul was seated changes throughout history. And was it ever seated in the blood? I can't remember. Was that like seen to be a life force?
Yeah, I'm a little hazy on the details now, but there's times and places where different aspects of the body were considered the seat of the self. I mean, there was a time when your gut was considered the seat of the self, right? When people talk about trusting your gut, that actually goes way back. It goes a long way back to people feeling like this was where, you know, you were, not necessarily here or here. So it is true. We've really changed how we think about things over time. And certainly people have tried to locate the soul at different times. You know, they've attempted to find the soul in the body. Even early anatomists, I'm sure you've written about this, Lindsey. You know, someone thought it was in the pituitary gland. I can't remember who it was now. Was it Vesalius that thought it? I might.
I don't know that one. That sounds like a great Twitter thread coming your way, everybody.
So I might have the details wrong, but it's true. We have changed our sense of, and also if you think about it culturally, many cultures feel that you aren't just yourself. You're also the land that you walk on and the air that you breathe. You know, there's a real connection to environment that we don't always have in the Western culture. So I think that it can be somewhat limiting. Your second question, though, is also really worth answering, which is, will we get to a point where paralysis is a thing of the past, where a severed spinal cord doesn't mean that you control your body? It's a complicated question. Some of the more interesting things that I researched at the near end of the book concern brain gate and a couple of other different research projects where they're trying not to, there are people trying to fix the spinal cord, stem cells, polyethylene glycol, etc. But there's also people trying to think that you can skip. Oh, someone just said it was Descartes. Descartes and the pituitary gland. Thank you. That you can skip.
A smart audience out there.
I know, I love it.
Know it all.
Oh, it's perfect.
Showing us up. No, I'm just kidding.
Trying to wire the brain directly to muscles and things. So seeing if you can figure out if we can implant some things here and then implant some things in your muscle, can you move a paralyzed organ just by skipping that superhighway altogether? We haven't made huge strides, but there are strides being made. And it's not completely beyond the pale to think that we might be able to correct some of that in the future. That doesn't necessarily mean that we should then go ahead and do a brain transplant or a head transplant. But it does mean that science is constantly ticking over in these ways. And again, I think one of the things I hope the book encourages everyone to do is to ask really hard questions about who decides what science gets done or how we do science, because that has changed too a lot over time. And I think that's important. We have I think many of us just assume there's a series of rules out there somewhere that's keeping everybody between the lines. But those rules are somewhat flexible and they change over time.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, anybody out there who's a fan of Mary Roach, you're going to love this book. There's a lot of quirky science in there, but there also, I mean, you raise core ethical questions that I think are going to get people thinking about today. And going back to that idea that nothing's created in a vacuum, a lot of the positive medical progress that has been made, things that we view positively, have dark roots to them, were controversial in its own time. So the idea that, you know, White was doing these experiments, which might seem unsettling to us. I mean, a lot of his work, as you say, I mean, his legacy is his patients that he saved, these people that are walking around living today and their children and their grandchildren and so forth and so on. By the way, I just want to tell you, there's some love for Death Summer's coat in the comments here. It's hard to like go through the questions and also listen to everything. But I just absolutely love this book. And I think that you've done such a brilliant job. And it has just been such a pleasure to read it. I know we're going to be wrapping things up. I think Politics and Prose are going to be popping in here in a second, asking us what we're reading right now. But everybody, you guys got to pick up this book, Mr. Humble and Dr. Butcher. Mine's all marked up because I absolutely loved it. I read it twice. And Brandy is a fantastic storyteller. She also writes fiction. You're just going to really fall in love with this book, and make sure that you also follow her on social media because she's got weird stories to tell. So I see Courtney is back, our moderator here.
This has been such a fascinating talk. Thank you both so much for being here. And you're right, I am going to ask, what are you reading right now and what would you recommend?
Brandy, over to you.
Well, I've been rereading some old mystery fiction. because I love mystery fiction. I'm an Agatha Christie fan all the way. So I have been doing that. In nonfiction, I recently read Underland by McFarlane. That is fantastic. That is a really fascinating read if you like nonfiction that's both sort of, I love the sort of philosophical angle. I feel like you go through an entire life journey as you are reading a book like that one. So that's another one that I really, really love.
Well, I am reading Stephen King's latest book later. That's not going to come as a surprise to my followers. I love Stephen King. You guys all know that. It's a creepy book. But in the nonfiction, Brandy's fantastic editor has sent me a book that I am just about to start tonight called The Invention of Miracles, about Alexander Graham Bell and his quest to cure deafness. And what I loved about the back of the book is it says, it's a heartbreaking look at how heroes can become villains, because as we know from Brandy's book, everybody has a little bit of good, a little bit of bad. We're very complex people. And this looks like it's gonna be a fantastic read. It's not out yet, it's out in April. So I like to give plugs to new authors, especially that are coming on the scene. So definitely look for this, because I'll be plugging it on social media. So yeah, Stephen King, who doesn't need a plug at all. I wish Stephen King would plug me for God's sake. But this book definitely, if you like narrative nonfiction and you like history, science, and medicine, that's going to be up your alley. So again, Brandy, it's so nice to see you from across the pond, and I hope that we can catch up in real person. And everybody who joined us, thank you so much for coming out and supporting an author on her release of her book. Ways you can support her: you can buy the book, or you can just tweet about it on social media. You can ask your library to order it. You tell people about it. Anything you do helps writers, and we need help right now during the pandemic. So thanks so much, guys, and thanks for supporting Politics and Prose as well.
Thank you so much for everything, everybody. And of course, once again, always great to talk to Lindsey and to be part of a talk at an independent bookstore. So buy your books from independent bookstores.
Definitely. No Amazon. All right, guys. Thanks so much. See you out there.